Okay, let's look at the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which, as you can see, did not last as long as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Neo-Babylonian Empire began with the conquest of the Assyrian Empire and the incorporation of much of that territory. Um, the Assyrian Empire was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, who is probably the most famous of the Neo-Babylonian kings. He's mentioned in the Bible. It's he who destroys the temple in Jerusalem and deports many of the people from Jerusalem, many of the ancient Judeans or Judah. Actually, at that point, they're technically called Judahites because they were from the southern kingdom of Judah, and they were deported. These are the ancestors of Jews today. They were deported to Babylon, and many of them remain there. And there was a pretty sizable Jewish community in Mesopotamia up until about the 1940s. So many people trace the Jewish community in what became Iraq to over 2,000 years ago. The capital, Babylon, this was also the capital of Hammurabi, but the old Babylonian remains are underneath these, the Neo-Babylonian remains. It's a very large site, obviously, and not all of it's been excavated. Portions of it have. The famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon have not been identified, if they did exist or not. Those were supposedly one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, according to Greek historians. The ziggurat that has eroded down, but was once very, very large in Babylon, may have served as the inspiration for the Tower of Babel. At least that's what many people believe. The Judahite or Jewish deportees living in Babylon, compiling the different books of the Bible at that point, probably were somewhat inspired by this huge ziggurat in Babylon, and the tale of a mighty king, and the diverse languages spoken in Babylon that probably became part of that story of the Tower of Babel. Now, within the Neo-Babylonian city, we'll look just at a couple of things. We're not going to talk about it in depth, or the Neo-Babylonian Empire in that much depth, but we will talk about this processional way and the Ishtar Gate, which are two of the most famous things that have been excavated from the site of Babylon. The Ishtar Gate and the processional way were very important, especially during the New Year's celebrations, when there was a very, very large procession that would go from one temple through the Ishtar Gate along the processional way. And this was a very important ritual and event. Here you can see the famous Ishtar Gate. The Babylonians did not have, or they didn't create the kinds of stone stela that we saw in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. What they did create were these baked bricks, and also these beautifully glazed baked bricks. And some of these motifs I'm sure you've seen in other places. But the Ishtar Gate in Babylon was taken apart and brought back to Berlin. It's now in the Pergamon Museum. And this is it in the Pergamon Museum. And you can see these beautifully created blue glazed tiles with depictions of different animals like bulls and these kinds of dragon-like creatures, and also these sort of palm frond motifs as well. Okay. Here you can see more of the Ishtar Gate. This is a replica that now is actually at the site of Babylon. And that's one thing we'll talk about at the very end of this week. is whether some of these things should be returned, or at least the controversy that usually surrounds the keeping of these things in Western museums. Here you can see some of these are like the sort of dragon motifs, similar to the fearsome dragon that the main god of the Babylonians, Marduk, fights. And so Marduk is the main god of the Babylonians. Here you can see a bull, and these are some of the tiles from the processional way that are now in the Berlin Museum as well. You can see recreating the processional way in the museum leading up to the Ishtar Gate over here. Many of the animals on the processional way are lions, and as we talked about before, lions are a symbol of Ishtar. Inanna was usually shown standing on the lion. Right? The lion usually represents Ishtar, so there's lots of depictions of lions. In fact, 2 lions from the processional way are in the museum at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. So again, if you ever get to that museum, you'll get to see some of these. So here's the processional way in the site of Babylon, as you can see here. And this is what it might have looked like way back when, during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is sort of on a non-processual day when they're not having that important ceremony, but the sort of hubbub of everyday life, people carrying goods back and forth, probably to and from their houses and markets and things like that. And here's yet another kind of depiction. It gives you an idea of what it might have been like in ancient Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar was a pretty impressive military commander, but the Babylonians were not as organized in some respects in terms of administration as the Assyrians were, which is one of the reasons why some scholars believe their empire didn't last as long. So you can see here, this was part of the beginning of the creation of the Babylonian Empire, the conquest of this territory, and then finally the conquest of the Levant. And king of Judah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. This is written about in many books in the Bible, like Kings and Chronicles, and also the book of Jeremiah. This is the time period of the prophet Jeremiah, who warns the king against rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar, because the kings rebelled twice. Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and deported many of the people back to, especially the elites and the craftspeople and the people who had skills, back to Babylon. Okay, now the final king next and final king after Nebuchadnezzar was Nabonidus, and he was not very popular among his own people because he kind of moved away from the worship of Marduk towards the worship of the moon god. And so when the Persians, who had been growing in strength down here in what's now, southwestern Iran, finally became very, very powerful, they marched into Babylon supposedly unopposed, and to cheers of the people who were happy to get rid of their own unpopular king. Cyrus II of Persia defeated the Babylonian army and ushered in the next empire, the Achaemenid or Persian Empire, which you can see lasted a couple hundred years. We're going to see when we look at the Persian capital, we're going to see that there's some important differences between the way the Persians depicted their empire and depicted themselves in art versus the ancient Assyrians. And there also was a difference in how they administered and ran the empire as well. Many people like to focus on this document. This is the Cylinder of Cyrus the Great. And what it does is it talks about people who were moved from their land by the Assyrians or the Neo-Babylonians, being able to return to their ancestral land, including the ancient Jews, which is why Cyrus is given a very good reputation in the Bible, actually. He allowed, according to this decree, the Jews could go back from Babylon to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. But there's a list of all sorts of other peoples where he's granting the same thing. He also has a very kind of liberal attitude toward subject peoples. They can worship their own gods. There's a little bit less cultural hegemony, as long as they pay their taxes and they, admit that the Persians are the ones in charge, they could kind of do many of the things the way they did before. Now, sometimes this cylinder is called the First Declaration of Human Rights. Some scholars think that's a little bit of an exaggeration because they say, well, it is expressing a liberal attitude to subject people, and it is restoring repatriated people and restoring cultic centers like the temple in Jerusalem, but it's not an international declaration of human rights like we see after World War I or after World War II. It's really just a liberal imperial policy, right? This is the tomb of Cyrus II. The tombs were a little less lavish than some of the other ancient Near Eastern rulers. We're not going to talk about all the ancient Persian kings. Some of them you'll recognize their names, like Darius or Xerxes. Darius is the Persian king under who the Battle of Marathon against Athens takes place, and Athens is able to withstand Persian forces for a while. Xerxes is the king where we had the last stand of the 300, where in the movies sort of portrayed inaccurately. You get sort of the feeling that the Greek army won, and Athens was actually burned after that battle. So I don't know if I would call it a great victory. They considered it a heroic last stand, but overwhelming victory, I do not think it was. The Persian Empire is known today, in terms of archaeology especially, by its capital city, Persepolis. I'm sure many of you have heard the name Persepolis before. It was an imperial city like Nineveh, like Babylon. It was the seat of the empire. Tablets have been found here, archives have been found here that talk about the administration of the empire like we've seen in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But I just thought we're not going to talk about it in great detail, but what I do want to point out, and what many people do look at, is the way the empire is depicted in the artwork on many of the important buildings. It's different, as you'll see, compared to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Here's a view of Persepolis from the air. You can see a little bit here. Persepolis was destroyed by Alexander the Great's army as Alexander the Great was conquering the Persian Empire. Now, this is a very typical scene. What you see are, these are, I think, Medes, and they are going up along a processional way. Many of them are bearing gifts. So many of the artwork, much of the artwork depicts soldiers, but it doesn't depict soldiers in battle or decapitating people or flaying people alive or storming cities. Usually a parade of soldiers, but more often than not, different ethnic groups and different peoples from different parts of the empire bringing offerings and gifts to the Persian emperor. That is mainly what you see depicted. So very different from what you see on the Neo-Assyrian reliefs, where there's a lot of hunting scenes or the king performing rituals or lots and lots of military conquest depicted and the aftermath of battles, the sort of decapitation, piling up of heads, flaying alive, all that sort of thing that was meant to intimidate people. Here, the message is that the Persian Empire is powerful and strong, and people from all across the empire come and bear gifts and pay homage to the Persian emperor. And one of the great things about these artistic depictions is the ethnicity is indicated by the hairstyles and dress of the people. So you can see that they're all kind of dressed differently. We'll look at some of these in just a second. This is part of one of the main entryways, the Gate of All Nations. And now you can see they have a Lamassu style figure as well, but it's not an Assyrian style Lamassu. It's similar, but you can tell the difference in style between the Persian style and the Assyrian style. Within one of the halls here of this main part of the city is where you can see many of these depictions of people carrying goods and gifts to give to the Persian emperor. And again, another scene as we've seen, such an ancient motif. We saw this, back in the Uruk period and even before. This sort of wild beast preying on a domesticated animal, the kind of conflict between domesticated and wild, civilization and the frontier of civilization. So let's look at some of the ethnic groups who paid homage to the Persian Empire, which was at its height the largest empire. So it was larger than the Babylonian or Assyrian Empire because it stretched from here, Asia Minor to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and then this whole Persian territory over here. Okay, so let's look at some of the different ethnic groups. We had Babylonians, as you can see, from southern Mesopotamia. Lydians from central Anatolia. The Lydians are actually the ones who developed coinage around 500 BC. They stamped small, round ingots of gold with an official seal so people knew it was pure gold. And these became the first coins. Syrians, you can see here. People from Cappadocia. This is kind of southern Anatolia. Scythians. Some of you have heard of the Scythians before. They're from the steppe land. What sort of the area of Georgia leading into Russia. They were a people that were very good at horse riding and archery on horseback, and were an important part of the Persian army. Right? And you can see very distinctive headgear, and here he is being led by a Persian or a Mede by the hand here. Greeks, Ionian Greeks, right? So some of the Greeks who lived on the sort of western part of Turkey were part of the Persian Empire. There were Greeks who were mercenaries sometimes in the Persian army. And so we'll talk a little bit about this, but some people portray the wars between the Greeks and the Persians as an early version of East versus West, and it was not that at all. That is taking a modern, really kind of anachronistic view. The Greeks at this point had more in common and more relations with their eastern neighbors, the Persians, than they did with Europeans to the north of them, who they considered to be uncultured, uncivilized barbarians. Bactrians, right? So these are people, again, kind of in that, getting into that sort of Central Asian. You can see the two-humped camel over here. All the way as far as India and North Africa. So Libyans, right on the border with Egypt. There are depictions of people bringing the gifts and presenting them to the king, the Persian king. Here's Darius, or Dariush, on his throne. And we can really see that gift exchange was one of the most important elements of Persian ideology. There's a whole archive of tablets from Persepolis that are continuing to be translated and studied. Many of them are in the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. If you've seen the movie 300, you know a little bit about the Immortals. This is what the Immortals looked like in actuality. They were called Immortals because there were always 10,000 of them. They were highly trained elite warriors. Whenever some were killed, they were replaced so that the ranks never reached below 10,000, which is sort of how they got this nickname or name, Immortals. Right? Okay, you won't have to remember the kings, but I do want to mention, maybe remember Cyrus II. I'll give you a sort of a study guide of the different figures in the ancient Near Eastern history that you should sort of remember. But Xerxes is the king in the movie 300. If you've seen that movie, he's the king during this battle between Greece and the Persian Empire. The Battle of Thermopylae is where you have the last stand of the 300 Spartans. There were also other Greek soldiers there who usually are not included in the tale. And the movie, it was not accurate history, go figure. Boy, big surprise. It was an entertaining movie. I don't think it was meant to be a documentary, but you can see the way Xerxes is depicted in the movie versus the way Xerxes probably looked like in real life. Right? And again, even though there was war between Greece and Persia, there was also war between Athens and Sparta and different Greek city-states. And yeah, there was an antipathy at some points between these cultures, but it was not sort of an East versus West, a Europe versus the Middle East conflict, as it's sometimes portrayed today. That's really taking a modern concept and applying it to the ancient world. After these Greek city-states, we of course have Philip of Macedon and then Alexander the Great, who Alexander the Great and his father Philip revolutionized warfare with these new kind of hoplite soldiers, you can see, with longer spears. Alexander was also very good at combining different kinds of forces, and also one of the reasons why Alexander was a great general is he was very adaptable. He could change his plans mid-battle when he realized that his initial plans were not working. And so Alexander conquered all of Greece, right, all of Asia Minor, Egypt, and then set his heart on conquering the Persian Empire. And in some ways it was a little bit of payback for some of the earlier Persian conquests of Greece. But he was really just going to conquer until he couldn't conquer anymore. He went all the way to India, at which point his soldiers couldn't take it anymore, and he was forced to go back home. But Alexander got sick and had to remain in Babylon, and he died in Babylon at the age of 33. And this famous mosaic depicts the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius III, right? The famous battle of Gaugamela in, I think it was 330 BC. And that is really the end of the Persian Empire, but it's not the end of Persian culture or Mesopotamian culture, right? You have for a while the descendants of Alexander ruling over these areas, but then the Parthians and the Sasanians and other Middle Eastern peoples take back much of this territory, right? So by the time of the Roman Empire, the Euphrates is really the limit of the Roman Empire. They cannot conquer this portion of the Middle East, and we enter a new phase and a new stage in Middle Eastern history until we get Christianity and then Islam. and then enter the what we would call the medieval period. Right? So that's where we're going to stop our discussion of the history of the ancient Near East.